reaction in the United States.
Well, they wanted it. They were resentful against England, right?
They were resentful against England, and there were many Americans who popularly supported the French Revolution, to the point where they were singing the Marseillaise and wearing the tricolor ribbons and cockades of the French Revolution. This stirring in the American public scared people like Washington. Always concerned about the public. In fact, one of his fears was that the general public might have been too invigorated by our own revolutionary discourse, and that we might have to temper this. Playing into this was a fear. I'm going to dim the lights again. A fear of democratic impulses among the public. Many of our founders were scared of the concept of democracy. Democracy meant appealing to the mob. The mob was unruly and dangerous and lacked the proper education and thought. If I asked you who the public were and what America looked like, there was indeed social leveling after the Constitution, right? A destruction of deference in many cases. Before the Constitution, you have Shays' Rebellion, which causes a major panic. After the Constitution, you see some social leveling. More Americans start to recognize themselves or identify themselves as a middling sort. Shopkeepers, farmers, businessmen, small businessmen. During the French Revolution, some Americans started to take on the role of calling each other citizen instead of by a title. In fact, that's another thing that started to die. The idea of people calling each other Mr. Mr. was a title for someone of respect, not just for anybody. The fear was that with this social leveling, the wrong sort of people might start to gain great influence over politics. Sorry, I'm skipping around here. I want to go a little out of the order I wrote this in. What kind of government Washington and Hamilton envisioned was a government that focused on strengthening commerce in the United States, that the United States would be best if it maintained its peace. Not to go to war, to maintain its defense, but also to stay at peace, to not get embroiled in the French Revolution or the problems that the French Revolution was causing in Europe, if it could avoid it, to bolster its commerce and manufacture, and the first major pieces of legislation in the Washington administration come from Washington had two very trusted advisors, you could say, up to a point. He trusted Alexander Hamilton in a way that he trusted few others. Did John talk about this relationship at all? Yeah.
He basically told us that Alexander Hamilton was a user.
In many ways.
Washington loved Hamilton.
Hamilton loved himself.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, very good. In many ways, Hamilton is a user, and that's the best. Washington looked after Hamilton. He treated Hamilton almost as a son. He and his wife Martha also were always concerned about some of Alexander Hamilton's dalliances and failings. According to one story, Martha Washington had a stud barn cat she named Hamilton. Every time he was visiting, she would make a point of calling said stud barn cat Hamilton as a way of, chiding him for his many dalliances. How does the nation establish a reliable financial foundation, a reliable economic system, firm commerce and manufacturing? What do you think we need? We could start with the report on public credit and the bank bill. I have links to the text of the report on public credit here. If we were to go through what Alexander Hamilton says, in the opinion of the Secretary, the wisdom of the House in giving their explicit sanction to the proposition which has been stated that an adequate provision for the support of public credit is a matter of high importance to the honor and prosperity of the United States cannot but be applauded by all who will seriously consider and trace through their obvious consequences these plain and undeniable truths. The exigencies are to be expected to occur in the affairs of nations in which there will be a necessity for borrowing. So in long Hamilton speak, what is the United States going to need to do at some future point? Borrow money. We need a system for that. That loans in times of public danger, especially from foreign war, are found an indispensable resource even to the wealthiest of them. And that in a country which, like this, is possessed of little active wealth, or in other words, little married capital, and the necessity for that resource must, in such emergencies, be proportionally urgent. So that in a country like this, possessed of little active wealth, little moneyed capital, we need moneyed capital in the United States. We need to grow this economy. And as on the one hand, the necessity for borrowing in particular emergencies cannot be doubted, so on the other, it is equally evident that to be able to borrow upon good terms, it is essential that the credit of a nation should be well established. In simple terms, what does the United States need? Good credit. Not junk bond status. Good credit. For when the credit of a country is in any degree questionable, it never fails to give an extravagant premium in one shape or another upon all the loans it has occasion to make. Nor does the evil end there. The same disadvantage must be sustained upon whatever is to be bought on terms of future payment. From this constant necessity of borrowing and paying dear, it is easy to conceive how immensely the experiences of expense of a nation in a course of time will be augmented by an unsound state of the public credit. So the public credit is of utmost importance. What will it help the United States accomplish? As we are a young nation, what do we need to do? Why is public credit so important? We need to grow. We need to be able to defend ourselves. So if we need to raise an army, fight a war, be embroiled, we need to borrow money, we need good credit, and we need to build a system in which we have a system of borrowing, of loaning. Do you remember what the provisions were for his report on public credit? What did he propose? Bank was the second part of that. There's a separate bill creating a Bank of the United States. So we can take it aside and talk about the Bank of the United States. Does anyone remember the provisions of the Bank of the United States? It would be chartered for a period of years. What was its purpose? Well, the Bank of the United States would be a place for the federal government to place its deposits. So when the federal government needed to use banking, it had a bank at its disposal. Would this kind of bank lend to, say, you to get a mortgage on your house? No. It was lending to big borrowers who were borrowing on short terms, 90 days. So they're taking out 90-day loans. Now, do you know how banks operated? There's no paper money as such at this time. There's specie, which is money, and people trusted specie, hard coin. Banks issued paper notes, which said that if you take this note to this bank, you will receive this amount in specie, hard coin. Great system, right? So you think if we were all given notes by the Bank of the United States and we all decided one day to claim our notes and we all walked into the Bank of the United States and said, please, please, we need our specie, would that bank be able to cover our notes? Absolutely not. In fact, in one statistic, one of these banks had something about $17 million in specie on hand and $90 million in notes. So banks would write notes, say this note is good, and it would become a form of money, could be exchanged. But a very important part of greasing the economy, lending when necessary. Now, the Bank of the United States is lending to large borrowers, companies, not individuals. They're also a safe place for the government to place its deposits. There are branches of this bank that open up in major cities and in not so major cities. But he saw this as an important part of giving the government its ability to borrow and function. Now, wait a minute. You just went through the Constitution, right? Where in the Constitution does it say I can charter a national bank? It doesn't. So I can't do it then. It's the crux of the argument between Hamilton and Madison, right? Did you discuss the bank yesterday at all? No. Hamilton proposes the bank, and he proposes this. So we have the bank on one side. Let's go back to this. In his report on public credit, he also argues that in order to put the United States and individual states on sound credit, during the Revolution, we borrowed a lot of money. And a lot of states borrowed money. What do you think would happen if we became a new government and just decided, well, those debts were with the old government, we're not paying them? Right? This is not a good thing for your reputation or credit. Hamilton says we need good credit. He also believed that the United States should carry a debt. He thought the idea of carrying a debt on and on wasn't a bad idea. Can you think as to why carrying a debt might not have been a bad idea? Okay, it could make people work to get rid of the debt, but he's not so interested in necessarily discharging the debt, but okay. The interest, but we're paying the interest. So
The relationship that it's going to provide with who we owe money to.
the relationship it's going to provide with who we owe money to. Okay, suppose we have foreign buyers of American national debt. They hold American bonds. They have a vested interest in getting their money back, don't they? So to Hamilton, in one sense, this is one part diplomacy. It also allows you to accomplish tasks that you couldn't do if you decided to keep a zero debt. You have a constantly financed debt, but Hamilton is also concerned, as is Washington and Adams. The United States government is still new, and that people need to feel the presence of the government about them, whether it be in the form of a standing army, whether it be in the form of a government carrying a debt load, or a bank. Hamilton saw or believed, as I had said earlier, that one of the strengths of Great Britain was its ability to borrow money, to support commerce, and to support an army and a navy to defend itself and support its commercial interests. His policies, the bank bill, report on public credit, are important for these reasons. This is the way he sees the United States going. The idea of a nation state that can protect itself, that has commerce. The response to his report on public credit from Madison and Jefferson were not favorable. One of the things that also got them angry with him was he said that, if you remember, I said the United States had all this debt, about I think $64 million of national debt and about $25 million of debt in the states. Hamilton proposed the United States federal government assume all of those state debts. So if you are Connecticut and you still have an outstanding debt, the United States says that debt's no longer yours, it's ours, we're paying it as a nation, as a country. Great, right? If you live in Connecticut, it's great, right? Connecticut no longer has to tax at a certain high rate in order to pay back their debt. Suppose I'm from Virginia, which in between the end of the Revolution and the ratification in this early period had pretty much discharged their debt. You're saying, wait a minute, this isn't fair. That state took those loans and borrowed that money. We didn't. Why should our excise tax money or other money go to pay for that? This is inherently unfair. Additionally, do you know how the debt can be sold, right? Right? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. This is sort of a modern concern. Oh, yeah. And when someone buys debt, it's often for pennies on the dollar of that debt. And they take that financial risk saying, okay, I'll put this much money forward, hoping I can collect that whole debt or some of it. Well, during this period of time, there were a number of Americans who held American bonds or state bonds. These were the people who owned American debt. They worried that that debt would never be paid. And so speculators came in and said, I will offer you 1/8 of what this debt is worth. If you let me, I'll give this to you now, and I take your debt certificate, your bond certificate. And many people sold their debt. So that many people who were the original holders of it no longer owned the debt. A speculator did. One of the things that started to irk Madison and Jefferson and other members of Congress was that Hamilton insisted that the entire debt be paid in full, that the United States commit to paying the debt. So, if we go back, who collects the debt? The United States is going to honor these bond certificates, and they're going to say, okay, if you hold a Connecticut bond, state debt bond from the Revolutionary War, come here, we'll issue you the new federal bond certificate, we'll give it to you. Speculators have them now. And so who gets paid for the debt? The people holding their certificate, right? That's what Hamilton says. Now, that's not fair, is it? I mean, you have the people who originally put forward that money, and they sold it because there was question as to whether we would uphold their debt or they'd be able to pay it.
It's called business.
It's called business?
Yeah.
Dirty business?
No, not necessarily. You took the chance. You took the chance. You knew what it was. I mean, if you're a business person.
Is it ethical?
You like Madoff, did you, John? You like Madoff?
Made up.
You took the chance. You could either take the chance on collecting or take the chance on selling it quick buck.
Sure, and this is Hamilton's argument to a T.
Isn't that just like the commercial, you need cash now, and they'll buy your lottery winning?
Right, and they give you a,
Portion of it, and they keep the rest.
right, you come up with an agreement, sure. You structure a settlement from
They're
them.
like speculators.
Right. Well, actually, I guess even more appropriate now is that some companies, someone may owe a company an X amount of dollars. They're tired of calling to try to collect it. they close the account, they sell the debt to a collection agency for pennies on the dollar, and the collection agency will try to recover that debt for themselves. You know, there's no claim by the original company that they can still get that money. They've sold the debt legally. But at this time, there's some question of this. And there is becoming a great deal of opposition to it in Congress. What's more is this gets complicated because some of these bondholders also happen to be veterans who sold their bonds when they were needy. And the question is this right? And does the government have the power to do this? It was their choice to sell. Hamilton,
The government wouldn't have the power to tell them, no, you can't sell it.
sure, they cannot tell them, no, you can't sell it. But can you create banks? The Constitution says doesn't say anything about creating banks. Should the federal government assume state debts?
So putting that into perspective now, if you drive up in your car and I say, I'll give you $1,000 for your car, and you're in need of money, and you say, yeah, I'll sell it to you, and I take it down the road and sell it for $5,000, where have I gone wrong?
Right.
Taking a chance.
Okay, all right, let me give you an example, okay? Let's assume that I know that you got a car for $5,000, but I also know that you got a car for $1,000, but I also know that you need money. So I call my friend Dave, and I said, Dave, John's desperate. If you offer him $1,000 for his car, he'll sell it,
Right.
because he's really desperate. And so Dave calls you and says, I'll give you $1,000 and you do it. And then Dave turns around and we sell your car for $5,000. You got $1,000. Now, what makes this a little bit sticky is the fact that I'm telling people that you're desperate, but everybody doesn't know that.
Right.
Only my friends do, and my name is Alexander Hamilton.
So you're saying insider trading?
I'm saying that Hamilton calls people and says, look,
Look.
we got all of these veterans out there that were paid in IOUs from the government, because the central government couldn't tax under the articles.
Right.
So all they did was give them IOUs. So I'm back on my farm in western Pennsylvania somewhere, and I got this IOU from the war. Year after year goes by, and so basically people come in and say, what is that? You say, at some point in time, the government's supposed to pay me for that, but it's been 8 years now, so I think that thing is worthless. I'm just gonna leave it to my kids as a token of the war for independence. And then along comes Dave,
We'll buy your
and
debt.
said, I'll buy that for 1/8 of 1/6 or whatever it is. If it's $10,000, I'll give you $500 for it.
Knowing that the federal government is.
And you say, hell, 500 in hand is better than 10,000 hanging on the wall. But the key is, he knows me, and I'm saying to him, I'm proposing, I'm Hamilton, and I'm gonna propose a bill where the federal government's, the new government's is gonna call in all of these IOUs and issue new ones. And this poor sucker up in western Pennsylvania doesn't know that. So along comes Dave and says, I'll give you 500. He said, it's yours.
Right.
And he goes around and picks up every one of these he can, and he goes to the new federal government, turns them all in, and they issue these new things. He became rich.
Yeah, with that knowledge, it's puts a totally different light on it, knowing that Hamilton knew about it. But prior, we didn't know that we hadn't made that statement that Hamilton had done that. You understand?
Yes.
Not knowing the history of it.
This is
but
what,
after you know it, yeah. it
to
puts
me,
a
this is
light
what
on it.
Obama's wrestling with now, are these people on Wall Street
Right.
that ripped off everybody.
Right.
You know?
And this isn't the first problem that they had to deal with speculators, of course. There were a number of Revolutionary War veterans paid in land certificates, given land bounties. And a similar situation occurred where they needed the money, and speculators set up areas, and so you have a number of people coming right out with their land certificates and selling them for a fraction of the amount because they needed the money. And there are speculators who knew that they were coming through and going to be buying this. And then they got their land. for very cheap.
One of the interesting things that, remember John Comiskey was talking about Schuyler?
Yeah, Philip Schuyler.
Being very wealthy, it's, you know, big wealthy. Hamilton married his daughter.
Daughter. Yeah.
You know, I mean, he married into this.
And as we'll talk about later, you know, Schuyler is a big political rival of Aaron Burr, which also feeds the Burr-Hamilton problem.
I think we see that then and now the government doesn't tell the general population.
Not always, not everything, no.
Only what benefits them at the moment.
Yeah. And so Madison is also arguing not only on principle, saying, hey, this is unfair to the original bondholders. They should be paid something. But it's also unfair to us Virginians. Why is it unfair to us Virginians? We've already paid our debt. Why should we be assuming these other states who took on money they can't pay back? The problem got worked out, actually, quite slickly. It was suggested one day in Congress that one of the things that may help smooth this problem or help solve it was actually deciding where the future capital would be. And so Thomas Jefferson, back from France, arranged a meeting, a dinner, where Hamilton and Madison could sit down and talk about things. Jefferson claimed, well, you know, I've been out of the country for so long. I have no idea what's going on. I don't write letters and talk to everybody. I don't correspond, and I have absolutely no political interest in any of this whatsoever. I'm just bringing together two people who have failed to agree, and hopefully we'll work something out over polite conversation at dinner. One of those other things that people write and don't believe. Well, maybe he did believe it, but over dinner, they agreed on a compromise. Madison would throw support to the report on public credit, the assumption of debts, and the payment of the bonds in return for a concession that the new capital be put in Washington, D.C., that there be a new capital founded, and it's right there. There were a number of arguments made, by the way, to support why the capital, Washington, D.C., should be where it is. One of the, I thought, most clever and ridiculous at the same time was that it was supposedly a perfect alignment if you drew a certain line from the northern boundary of the United States to the southern one and put an exact spot. It was the exact midpoint. There was another good one that if you laid out certain points on the compass, it was exactly in proper relationship to where George Washington lived, where his home was, Mount Vernon. Madison tried to do everything. But this compromise saves the financial plan and also gives us the capital, Washington, D.C. But what we also see emerging still is this fighting between Madison and between Hamilton, these important political disagreements. One of the other things to come out of the administration were new excise taxes, which also people like Adams and Hamilton believe also helped let people know that the federal government was there and operating. Excise taxes on sugar and also on liquor. At this time, there were farmers in the western part of the United States. And when I say the western part of the United States, do you know what I mean? What location am I talking about? West Virginia, western Pennsylvania, right? There's something separating these parts from the East Coast. Mountains. And most of the people in the West are farmers. And they rely on eastern markets to transport their goods for sale, their produce for sale. However, the cost of raising crops, transporting them overland across the mountains, and selling them at markets for a profit is almost impossible. It's very expensive. So many farmers start to convert crops into something less perishable. And what that is? Liquor, whiskey. Well, the excise tax on whiskey taxed their business. Whiskey for home consumption was not taxed. Like if you were making it for yourself, that was not excised. Many farmers were outraged, and people in the West were outraged by the whiskey tax, by the excise tax. Also noting that certain liquors were exempt from excise, such as the fine Madeiras, the fine wines that people like Alexander Hamilton were known to drink and be fond of. It also meant that there were whiskey excise tax collectors who would be sent out west to collect the whiskey excise tax. How do you think they were received?
Tar and feather.
Well, one of the problems was some people just would not volunteer for that job. And if you offered it to them, they wouldn't take it. And a few who were able to take it didn't like the job very much and didn't last long. They were met with great resistance. But what we're seeing is also how decisions made on this sort of high plane, sort of this esoteric stratosphere, have these real-life effect and implications. A number of the farmers decided that they would not allow the tax to be collected and would fight it. And it led to armed resistance. Now, if I take this into account with a similar spirit of the French Revolution and the language of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and that some common people in the United States were picking up on this, these two meld together. And so you have people espousing liberty, equality, fraternity, singing the Marseillaise, wearing the tricolor cockades, and fighting against the federal government in the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, I know yesterday, John, you mentioned what the textbooks always say. There's a difference between what the stuff that you read in the textbook and then there's the stuff outside of it. In the textbook, do you remember what's the one mention you always get when you read about the Whiskey Rebellion? It always says it's proof that the Constitution worked. Right? Why is it proof that the Constitution worked? Because right, the government was able to suppress the Whiskey Rebellion fairly quickly, as opposed to Shays' Rebellion. And how did it respond? It responded with pomp and circumstance. It didn't just send out a detachment of soldiers, some militiamen. It sent out the army. It just didn't send anyone in the army out. Hamilton and Washington suited up in the old uniforms and rode out. Of course, Washington only went a little ways and then went back. Hamilton took them out, showing the authority of the government. Of course, I think this is about more than just the Constitution worked. Of course, it shows that there's still a great deal of disagreement over the nature and the type of government we were to have. That it demonstrates some of the real-life problems being faced by Americans in the West. An important area, something that everyone recognized, said we should expand West. The West is necessary, but it was a difficult life on the West. It is also important because it shows how concerned people like Washington and Hamilton were about the public. Let's take a look. I have this document here. If you're not familiar with the Avalon Project at Yale Law School, it's a great website with lots of useful U.S. history documents on it. By authority of the President of the United States of America, whereas combinations to defeat the execution of the laws laying duties upon spirits distilled within the United States and upon stills have from the time of the commencement of those laws existed in some of the western parts of Pennsylvania, whereas the said combinations, proceeding in a manner subversive equally of the just authority of government and the rights of individuals who have hitherto effected their dangerous and criminal purpose by the influence of certain irregular meetings, whose proceedings have tended to encourage and uphold the spirit of opposition by misrepresentations of the laws calculated to render them odious. Some of these societies meeting, talking about a conflict they started to see between aristocrats or monocrats and Republicans. The monocrats being people like Hamilton, people who were trying to effect, in essence, a monarchy. Washington sent the army. Here's his actual order, his proclamation. By the way, as an aside about people in early America at this time, drinking was something that was a part of life. It was a very important part of life. The best part, right? Today, do you know on average how many gallons of liquor Americans drink? The average American drinks over the course of a year. You would think it's a lot. It's not really. I think it's under 1. 1 gallon. It's about 1 gallon maybe, or just under, of liquor.
We're talking about hard liquor, not
Right,
beer.
not beer. I think if you add beer, it's still not that much more. Beer is not as common here because beer needs refrigeration to stay fresh for transport. So people made beer, they drank beer, but what people were drinking really back then was hard stuff. Throughout these years, the average per capita consumption of hard liquor, 5 gallons. 5 gallons of liquor per person. It started man, woman, and child. And when you exclude, of course, people held in bondage, slaves were not legally allowed to drink. And this statistic was gotten by a scholar. There's a great book about it. It's called The Alcoholic Republic by an author named W.J. Rohrabach. And he goes through excise tax records, and that's how he comes up with a statistic. But if you figure a number of people were violating the excise tax or making their own stuff, the statistic is probably much higher. But drinking was an important part of life. Drinking whiskey. Water was not reliable or good in a lot of parts. They drank liquor. And it started from the cradle and went to the grave. Parts of the day revolved around this ritual. Children were often given little drops of whiskey on their teeth when they were teething, little drops in the bottle to season them to it. Workmen went throughout their workday in their shop, and they'd have a tenor where they'd stop and have a drink at 10. They'd stop and have a shot at lunch or something like that. They'd have a little bracer after lunch. They'd go after work, they'd have a bracer. They'd go home and have a bracer with dinner. They'd have an after-dinner bracer.
They have a nightcap.
They'd have a nightcap. Drinking was part and parcel of many common people's lives. And so this tax negatively affected them. They acutely felt the presence of government. So if the goal is we need excise taxes, we need these things to make sure people know that our government is about us, well, it worked. They certainly knew. They didn't like it.
How much did the women drink?
Women were not, it was not ladylike to drink like that. They often had special drinks for women, often highly sugared drinks for ladies, but women were also drinking, yes.
Well, one reason was that at that point, a lot of the water supply
Right.
was not,
Right.
healthy for them to drink. They had a choice of milk, which was not pasteurized
Right.
at the time. And, the liquor, the hard liquor was the only
Right.
sanitary, healthy drink for them to
Right.
drink at that time.
Right. I mean, they could boil the water, they could make tea, but liquor was much better than tea, I guess. And so, yes, while today we think that maybe we drink a lot as a people, I can assure you it doesn't match the people of the early republic. But this tax acutely affects them. They do feel this. When the debate goes up between Madison and Hamilton over creating the bank, Madison, of course, argues, Jefferson argues, hey, you can't do this. You're not allowed. The Constitution says we can't make a bank. Madison says, you can't do that. You can't make a bank. How does Hamilton defend it? He says, it is constitutional allowed because we are allowed to do things that are necessary or proper, and proper. And it's necessary and proper to support our commerce. We'll go back to that later. But very early on in this administration, there does seem to be a divide, a political disagreement between Jefferson, who is, by the way, in Washington's cabinet, right? Jefferson is serving as Washington's Secretary of State. Hamilton, who's serving as Secretary of the Treasury. So cabinet meetings were a real blast. In fact, often most of the recollections in these cabinet meetings talk about how they sniped at each other and that Washington wrote them on several occasions. Please, calm down. Find a way to get along. He tried to work with both of them. Madison being in the House, not so much of a problem, but still, Madison is always this force along with Jefferson. He would always sign his letters, of course, your humble and obedient servant. He mentions in one letter, I am always at the ready. Washington trusted Madison. Washington trusted Hamilton. Hamilton loved himself. Hamilton was the user, right? Something happened between Washington and Madison during his administration, though. The ratification of a treaty. Madison tried to find a way to get the treaty sent to Congress so that Congress could have say over its ratification. Of course, the House of Representatives has what say over treaties? Zero. It's the Senate. Right. It's the Senate. Madison tries to make this argument. After the convention, today the notes on the convention of 1787 we have are whose notes? Madison's. They're Madison's notes. Afterwards, he gave them to Washington for safekeeping, hoping that they would not be released, at least not while he was alive. Could you imagine what would have happened if those notes had been released generally to the public during his lifetime? Like right then? Let's see. People would have found out that he thought that the federal government should have a veto power over the states, or state laws. He would not have been the most popular guy. Washington consulted his copy of Madison's notes, wrote them up, cited them, and sent them an official response that was somewhat public. This outraged Madison. He felt he had been absolutely ill-used by the president, that he betrayed his trust. Washington also started to distrust Madison. And that was the end of that advisory relationship Madison would have with Washington. Before that time, he would often call on Washington's house, visit on his way through, talked to his friend. After that incident, it was over. They were done. And while the French Revolution is going on in France, the French are certainly trying to say, hey, United States, remember how we helped you out? Well, your turn now. We're your friends. We've got treaties. And Washington has to sift through this early on in his administration. What does the United States do? What's the dangers of becoming embroiled with the French or in this French Revolution? Committing resources and, of course, upsetting the English, because the English were started getting ready to move against France. Other powers in Europe are getting ready to move against France. The United States says, hey, wait a minute. We're new. We don't have a big army. We don't have a big navy. We need to back away. However, there was a certain expectation. The French sent a minister, Genet, to the United States as a representative. The question was, now, by the way, if you're a minister being sent to the United States, where do you think you would go? Washington. Back then, the capital's in Philadelphia, so you figured they would go to Philadelphia. No. Strategically, he landed in the South, in the American South, and started slowly traveling north to Philadelphia. Along the way, trying to garner sympathetic public support for the French Revolution and the French cause. Washington sat there fuming in Philadelphia, seeing what this man was doing. Of course, Genet had been getting letters from people like Thomas Jefferson saying, yes, I think the Americans might support. Yes, we may even, his friend James Monroe said, we may even supply you with a $5 million loan. The act of actually receiving Citizen Genet also means that the United States officially recognized the French Republic. The first country to really do so. But the question was, is the United States bound by treaty to France? Washington asked his cabinet. The ultimate answer is that they said, no, we've signed the treaty with your king. You've now killed him. We are not bound by those treaties. However, his advice was actually, we are, but we should find a way to stay out of it. Of course, Thomas Jefferson issued that opinion. Quickly, what Washington found in his cabinet meetings as his advisors backbit and fought with each other. Washington was also getting very tired. And when it came time for him to think about finishing his one term and going home, there was one thing his cabinet and many people agreed upon. George Washington needed to remain president for a second term. Many people originally thought he would just serve until he decided to go home. And that would be it. But he took on the second term, once again unanimously elected by the electors, and in his second term found that the opposition that was growing, or what he saw as a growing splinter in American politics into parties, was becoming more acute. It was exacerbated. It was much more noticeable. That there had been this splinter before, that is true. But certain incidents exacerbate it. He also suffers a serious problem. I guess here's a great question. If you disagree with a policy that Washington ultimately supported or backed, for example, the report on public credit, how do you attack that policy without attacking Washington? Yeah, this is something that you also cover to a degree in when you teach modern U.S. history, especially in the first New Deal. How do you attack Roosevelt's policies without seemingly attacking FDR and becoming immediately unpopular in some circles? How do you attack Washington's policy? Sometimes attacking a certain policy could mean or look as if you were attacking Washington. If you disagreed with his decisions, how do you question them without yourself becoming the object of criticism? Well, they found ways. And as Washington went through his second term, more of these criticisms came out, especially late. But there's also something new that pops up that helps a sort of medium for this. And it's the new style of press in the United States. New newspapers pop up, and they have political affiliations, of course, but they are run by people who are thinking of ways of making profit and publishing scandal. One way of attacking a policy or a political opponent was by presenting this material in the newspaper for the public to see. What kinds of things get released in this type of press, and who pays for them to write this? Well, it depends. If you're Thomas Jefferson, you pay a guy like Philip Freneau or James Callender to write some things somewhat questioning Hamilton, the administration. Some people send these men money to publish a story during the election of 1800 that, realistically, John Adams was really planning to become a king or a monarch, and that upon his death he was going to have his son John Quincy crowned. And that went out in the newspapers. And of course, one newspaper picked up a story that there's this story about Thomas Jefferson who might have some children who aren't by his wife. Her name is Sally Hemings. Some receive private correspondence and they publish it. This would become a serious concern for George Washington. The United States was suffering problems diplomatically on a couple of fronts. First, the French were constantly trying to embroil the United States in the French Revolution. At the same time, the British were not respecting the Treaty of Paris. They had not vacated posts on American territory, and they were not necessarily observing American shipping rights. The Spanish were also trying to foment problems in America's western borderland. Washington is trying to avoid war. He is also trying to pursue a policy or a course of action to support commerce. So throughout, as Britain went to war with France, the United States thought, hey, great time. We can trade with both England and France, and our commerce should prosper. What do you think happened? It made them both angry. The British certainly weren't going to respect American shipping rights. And then the British also tried to encourage Indian raids on Western American settlements. And the French were starting to say any American ship carrying British goods can be seized, not respecting American shipping. The British were doing the same. Washington dispatched John Jay to negotiate with the British to come up with a treaty to get them to follow and to leave the United States alone. John, did you want to stop now, or do you want?
Whenever's a good time for you to stop. You know, 5
Ye-
minutes, 10 minutes, whatever you need.
Let's get into J Treaty and then the
We've got to-
Adams.
Because once we break till 1:30.
Okay. Yeah, let's go through this now. Sorry. Um, Jay's Treaty was not well received by people like Jefferson or Madison. They thought that it showed the United States' willingness to work with Britain, its rebuff of France. And some people were concerned that it didn't still recognize or stick up for American rights. However, this treaty with Britain got them to vacate the outposts that were still on American borders, and Washington hoped this matter would be settled. It opened trade between American ships and the British West Indies. Small trade on smaller ships, but it still preserved some sense of commerce, and Washington hoped sort of put away any chances of conflict between the United States and Britain at that moment. This moment also firmly, once again, served as another sort of nail that further politically divided the two growing factions in American politics. The followers of Washington and Hamilton, even though Washington tries to remain above these politics, Washington, in my view, is firmly rooted in support of the Hamiltonian side, what they called Federalists later on. And this new group is called Democratic Republicans, or Republicans, was the side of Jefferson and Madison. There even, for a short period of time, sprouted up Democratic Republican societies. Now, these societies were not necessarily supported or encouraged outright by Jefferson and Madison. These were common people, regular people. What kind of regular people were they?
Farmers.
Some farmers. Surveyors. They were people who called themselves generally the middling sort. The middling sort. This growing group in America that also was concerned. And we'll talk a little bit about the social stratification in the United States when we return.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
When did they start impressing the sailors? Did both countries do that?
Actually, what happened was the British would impress American sailors. And for a while, the French had made a policy saying that if they caught a British ship and they found an impressed American sailor, they would hold him as a pirate, which they did. Impressing had begun informally by the early 1800s. And so literally, this was a serious problem for the United States. I mean, one, British ships are stopping American ships later on, boarding them and taking people off. I mean, you want to talk about a violation of national sovereignty, there you go. And then to exacerbate the problem, you have the French who say, well, if we stop one of these ships and we see an American sailor on it who's been impressed, he's a pirate to us. So we'll hold him for pirate. Speaking of pirates, one interesting thing the French were doing. The French wanted special access to American ports. In one case, the French captured a British ship, brought it to an American port, I believe Philadelphia, had it outfitted as a privateer vessel sailing with a letter of marque from France to raid British shipping. So the British had a ship stolen from them, brought to an American port, refitted, and sailed out by a mostly French crew, but also some Americans on board, with a letter of marque from the French government saying that they were raiding British commerce with the order of the French government. I think the British liked that. Not so much. They demanded full restitution, by the way, for their ship. No. The French want American involvement one way or the other. Americans want to trade. At least Hamiltonians want to trade. The end of the Washington administration, by the way, by 1796, Washington was thinking he was done. He also was concerned that he'd had a resignation in his cabinet about a year before he decided to stop or left office. Thomas Jefferson left his post and retired. Now you also have to understand that a lot of times when the men of this generation retired, much like Michael Jordan, they were known to come out of retirement. At this point, though, Washington was getting old. He was also growing concerned. Something that hurt his feelings very deeply was a letter sent by Thomas Jefferson to a former neighbor named Philip Mazie. In it, Mazie and Jefferson discussed a number of problems with American politics to his friend Mazie. But something that really stuck out was a special section that Jefferson wrote to Mazie about the situation in America. In which Jefferson accused someone, saying that there are some people who were Samsons in the field and Solomons in council, but these apostates have had their heads shorn. Now, in the fanciful talk of these men, Samson's in the field and Solomon's in council. Who do you think he's talking about? Strong and smart. And who's the strong and smart person? Who's the strong man in the field? Washington. In short, this letter was terribly critical of George Washington, calling him essentially an apostate, almost a traitor to the cause in many respects, that his decisions seemed to go back on the very principles of the foundation. Well, remember those scandalmonger papers? Mazie sent part of that letter, that part, to a paper, which got printed in Italian, which got reprinted in French, and which made its way across the ocean back to the United States, reprinted, and one day George Washington read it. Wondering what is going on. Jefferson tried to make up for this by denying it and, of course, writing to Washington fairly regularly, talking about crop rotations, gardening, special plants growing. This is a link to the letter, and we'll see the extract from the paper. And these are housed at Princeton. These are Thomas Jefferson papers. This is exactly, this is the excerpt here. Our political situation has prodigiously changed since you left us. Instead of that noble love of liberty and that Republican government which carried us triumphantly through the dangers of the war, an Anglo-monarchio aristocratic party has arisen. Their avowed object is to impose upon us the substance as they have already given us the form of the British government. Nevertheless, the principal body of our citizens remain faithful to Republican principles. All of our proprietors of lands are friendly to those principles, and it was the mass of men of talents. We have against us, Republicans, the executive power, the judiciary power, 2 of the 3 branches of our government, all the officers of the government who are seeking offices, all timid men who prefer the calm of despotism to the tempestuous of the sea of liberty. The British merchants and the Americans who trade on British capitals, the speculators, the persons interested in the bank and public funds. I should give you a fever if I should name the apostates who have embraced these heresies, men who were Solomons in council, Samsons in combat, but whose hair has been cut off by the whore England. This is pretty scathing stuff. They would wrest from us that liberty which we have obtained by so much labor and peril, but we shall preserve it. Our mass of weight and riches is so powerful that we have nothing to fear from any attempt against us by force. It is sufficient that we guard ourselves, and that we break the Lilliputian ties by which they have bound us in the first slumbers which succeeded our labors. This is a pretty scathing letter, a scathing excerpt. Now, imagine if you're George Washington and this is what you read. Someone throws that on your desk. Jefferson wrote to Washington trying to say, not sure I remember this, I wouldn't have done that. Let's talk about plants, let's talk about farming. I'm much too busy to talk about the past, I'm all about the present. It's sort of the Mark McGuire stance of the early republic. Washington's response: Dear Sir, when I inform you that your letter of the 19th went to Philadelphia and returned to this place before it was received by me, it will be admitted, I am persuaded, as an apology for my not having acknowledged the receipt of it sooner. If I had entertained any suspicions before that the queries which have been published in Backey's paper proceeded from you, the assurances you have given of the contrary would have removed them. But the truth is, I harbored none. He lies. I am at no loss to conjecture from what source they flowed, though what channel they were conveyed, and for what purpose and similar publications appear. They were known to be in the hands of Mr. Parker in the early part of the last session of Congress. They were shown about by Mr. Giles during the session, and they made their public exhibition about the close of it. Perceiving and probably hearing that no abuse in the gazettes would induce me to take notice of anonymous publications against me, those who were disposed to do me such friendly offices have embraced without restraint every opportunity to weaken the confidence of the people, and by having the whole game in their hands, they have scrupled not to publish things that do not, as well as those which do exist, and to mutilate the latter, so as to make them subserve the purposes which they have in view. As you have mentioned the subject yourself, it would not be frank, candid, or friendly to conceal that your conduct has been represented as derogatory from that opinion I had conceived you entertained of me. That to your particular friends and connections you have described, and that they have denounced me as a person under a dangerous influence, and that if I would listen more to some other opinions, all would be well. My answer invariably has been that I had never discovered anything in the conduct of Mr. Jefferson to raise suspicions in my mind of his insincerity, that if he would retrace my public conduct while he was in the administration, abundant proofs would occur to him that truth and right decisions were the sole objects of my pursuit, that there were as many instances within his own knowledge of my having decided against as in favor of the opinions of the person evidently alluded to, and moreover, that I was no believer in the infallibility of politics or measures of any man living. In short, that I was no party man myself, and the first wish of my heart was if parties did exist to reconcile them. Very generous, nice, polite, saying, I've always wanted to be a uniter, not a divider. You've given me your assurances you wouldn't have written this, Mr. Jefferson. Do you think he believes that? No. His note to Jefferson is, well, gentlemanly, polite, and written one way. What he is saying, I know what you did. Thank you. Most of the correspondence he receives from Jefferson after that, Jefferson will write about planting and things. Washington will have very, very curt responses. Washington knew Jefferson had trashed him. So let's pick up with the farewell address after lunch, and then we'll get into John Adams. Okay.
We convene at 1.